Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to the first of our five-part podcasting workshop series. Why podcast? This is going to be an introduction. I'm really excited to take this journey with all y'all over the next 5 weeks, whether you're going to join us in real time in the Zoom or watch these sessions on YouTube later. If you've registered before today, you would have received an email from me with these links and the links that I put in chat. In the interest of time, I'm going to do some preliminary stuff fairly quickly because we have a lot to cover today. But first, I'll introduce myself. My name is Pam Lack. I use she, her pronouns. I am the director of the Digital Humanities Center here at San Diego State and the Digital Humanities Librarian and the co-director of our campus-wide DH initiative. I'm joined by Patrick Flanagan, who is our Digital Humanities Center Programs and Operations Specialist. It's actually his day off. So I want to thank him for zooming in on a day when he's not supposed to be here at work. I want to begin with a couple of acknowledgements. First, the San Diego State acknowledgement, land acknowledgement. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony. We find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. I also want to acknowledge that this workshop wouldn't be possible without a lot of different technologies that are bringing us together. In particular, Zoom, which is headquartered on the traditional lands of the Ohlone and Tamiyan people in what we now call San Jose, California, and Google. A lot of our resources are being shared through Google, which is based on the traditional lands of the Tamiyan Nation, the Ohlone, the Ramaytush, and the Muwekma peoples in what we now call Mountain View, California. These technologies, which allow us to connect across vast distances, are not without invisible costs, both in terms of human labor and environmental impact. And I also want to acknowledge that a land acknowledgement is a starting place and not a replacement for repairing the injustice of present and past actions. So again, welcome to our podcasting workshop series. It's a 5-part, starting now, running through the end of October. And again, you can join us synchronously on Zoom or asynchronously catching up on anything you miss on our YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be doing a broad intro before we launch into recording, editing, releasing. And then for those of you who are faculty interested in incorporating podcast into your pedagogy, we'll be doing that as well. That link, that tinyurl.com, takes you to a Google Drive folder with a ton of resources. All of the slides for the next 5 weeks, tip sheets and training videos, sample audio to play with if you don't have any of your own to start with. There's a podcasting resources overview doc that serves as an index for this Google Drive folder. And there's also a link to a podcast studio spec sheet that Patrick and I have developed over the years. If you are at an institution that is looking to build a podcasting studio, we've shared our specs for doing a very cheap DIY approach to a very high-end expensive approach. And we've actually been doing both here at San Diego State. I also want to acknowledge that this is based on a week-long, intensive, immersive, hands-on podcasting institute that we run in partnership with the National Humanities Center twice a year. We actually have some of our Institute alum here in the Zoom with us today for a little refresher. That is a very intense week-long institute where you actually learn and produce a podcast in less than a week. This is a more skimming of the surface, superficial approach to that. So if you like this workshop series and you want to learn more, you're encouraged to sign up. We have 2 institutes scheduled for 2024. The first is in January for PhD students in the humanities and the humanistic social sciences. And then the June one is scheduled for faculty, librarians, academic staff, and independent scholars. There is a cost associated with the week-long institute. And for graduate students, the typical model is that an institution will sponsor students and send them. The link to the Graduate Student Institute is up now, and you can learn more about that and how to become a sponsoring institution to send students to this. And I'm always happy to answer questions over email about our institutes. So what are we going to be doing together today? We're going to talk very broadly about what is podcasting, what makes for a good one or a bad one. We're going to talk about how to get started. We're going to cover a little bit of file management and copyright. And for those of you who are thinking about scholarly podcasting as part of your academic identity, how to make it count in terms of promotion and tenure. Now, that's a lot of stuff, and we're definitely not going to cover everything in an hour. And my slides are packed with content and links. So I encourage you to grab the slides, download them, or copy them to your own Google Drive if you use Google, so you can follow out links and refer back to things later. With that, just really quickly, very curious to hear a little bit about your own experiences with Zoom. Sorry, not with Zoom, with podcasting. As I said, it's kind of early here on the West Coast. Whether you listen, are an avid listener, an occasional listener, you've never listened, and whether you've created any podcasts. I have a really quick Zoom poll, if I could find it. Oh, there it is. If you want to take a moment and just answer these two questions, how often do you listen to podcasts? And what's your experience, if any, creating podcasts? I also encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're coming from, what brings you here, what you're hoping to get out of this. Again, I won't be able to keep up with the chat in real time, but I will certainly read it after the workshop. We've got some really avid listeners of podcasts, people who listen either occasionally or all the time. We've had folks who've made a podcast once, and people who aren't sure if they want to make a podcast, which this is the right place to explore that. So we've got people who listen, but very few people in the Zoom have actually made one. So that helps me know where we're all coming from. In the interest of time, I'll go ahead and end the poll. Okay. And before I continue, just a really quick introduction to the Digital Humanities Initiative at San Diego State University. I'm sitting in the Digital Humanities Center, which is in our library, and we are the home of our interdisciplinary DH initiative. Our community takes a critical stance towards digital technology, and we focus our work on equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice in, through, and against digital tools. And as the hub of that work, the DH Center supports that anti-racist and anti-oppressive research, teaching, and learning. Most importantly, we value the importance of the humanities and the interactions of humans in real time and space in the digital age. If you're local to San Diego or you're in Southern California and you haven't come to the Digital Humanities Center or you haven't come here recently, do stop by. We're in the bottom of the library dome. For those of you who aren't local, if you're ever in San Diego, let me know. I would love to give you a tour of the DH Center. We offer several ways to connect in person and remotely, from fully face-to-face events to hybrid to these kinds of virtual events. As I've said, we have a YouTube channel of past events and tool tutorials. We engage in one-on-one consultations. You do not have to be at San Diego State to request a consultation. I engage in instruction and pedagogical support. But most importantly, we build community. You are now part of our community, no matter where you're Zooming from. And you're always welcome to join us for any of our events and reach out for help. Okay, so with that, let's dive into what is podcasting. So very briefly, and the most simple definition is we're talking about a digital audio file that lives somewhere online that's people download. We'll talk about RSS, what that means in the fourth workshop, but that's the mechanism that people use to download the podcast, or to access and download the podcast. We tend to use the term podcast interchangeably to refer to a show with one or more seasons and many episodes, but also to the actual episode. So we kind of use those interchangeably. Most podcasts are episodic. They are free, although there are paid subscription models out there. And we don't have time to talk about that today, but we might be able to get to that later on in the workshop series. And most typically, people will push their podcasts to a streaming service such as Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher. Subscribers will go through their podcast app, subscribe, and then the RSS will push the podcast to the platform for them to listen to. It's hard to know exactly how many podcasts are out there. By one count, there's close to 1 million. By another, there's 3 million. So it depends on who you're looking at. There's no one global index of podcasts, although people are trying to track all of that. But all that to say that podcasting is a wildly popular medium. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, particularly in COVID and in this phase of the pandemic. It's a very accessible technology in terms of learning how to create a podcast and how to produce one. And if you create your podcast correctly, it can be a very accessible podcast to listen to. It doesn't require heavy-duty computing. People don't need a laptop or a desktop computer to listen to it. They can listen on their phones. It's pretty accessible. It really fits that DIY ethos. And when people were stuck at home during the earliest months of the pandemic, it was something that they found that they could do at home. It's also a really intimate technology. If you think about how you might engage with podcasting, you might listen to podcasts with headphones in. So the sound actually might be coming into your body and you might feel a personal connection with other people. And I think for people in isolation during those early days of COVID, it might have helped them feel in community with others. It's also a really visual medium. Even though we're only talking about audio, you can get really creative in the play between voice, words, sound, music, all these things to create these really immersive and visual soundscapes. There's lots of different types and styles out there. We're going to be focusing on scholarly or pedagogical podcasts for the most part, but Barry Lamb, who's the creator of Hi-Fi Nation, says that there's 4 categories: monologue, lecture style, one-on-one interview, where you might be a host interviewing different scholars, different experts. Panel style is very popular, and broadly speaking, documentary, or which can encompass narrative audio, more digital storytelling, vox pop, where people get interviewed on the street, or more realistic types. There's also fictional podcasts out there, much more narrative-driven podcasts. This is not the complete list, but this is really more focused towards academic podcasting. As I said, it's a fairly accessible format. You don't need a lot to podcast. You need some sort of microphone. It doesn't even have to be a professional one. You need a computer of some sort, and if you're in a pinch, you can always use your phone. You need some space to record in, and if you can't get to a professional recording studio, you can actually create the conditions at home for decent recording or really good recording. You need some kind of software to record and edit. We use free software here in the Digital Humanities Center. And you need some sort of hosting space where you can park your podcast so it can be pushed out to different services. And there are free options out there as well. More than anything, you need ideas, you need energy, and you need time. And you need a team of people. Whether you're going to podcast solo or in community with other folks, it takes a community to create a podcast because you need listeners. You need to create that relationship with your audience. So those are the building blocks of a podcast. I'll just add, Patrick is keeping an eye on the chat. So if you have questions, feel free to use chat and he'll respond since I can't keep up with chat while I'm going through this. Now, full disclosure, I am not a podcaster. I have never created a podcast of my own, but I've taught more than 450 people how to podcast, typically in our week-long institutes with the National Humanities Center, but also by partnering with faculty, not just here at San Diego State, but all over the country to Zoom into their classes and teach podcasting and just help people when they come into the DH Center needing help. So, what's the expression, those who can't teach? I suppose I fall under that category. We've got lots of different and wonderful podcasts that our Institute participants have created over the years. Particularly, I want to emphasize Dispatches from Dystopia, which is one of the most experimental podcasts we ever saw come out of our institute. The team that produced that really tried to play with sound and experiment with form. And The Battle of the Green Fishes, which came out last winter, which is a really imaginative and really well-produced podcast. So if you have time to listen to some of these, they're all incredible. But some of these are the ones that have been made publicly available from our institutes over the years. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what makes for a podcast, a good one or a bad one. So I want y'all to take just a minute to think about the kinds of podcasts that you listen to. Let me pull up my notes here. What are the things that draw you in, that keep you listening, or the things that turn you off and make you not want to listen again? There are lots of things we can consider, and I invite you to think through some of these things. The actual content, the production values, the people who make the podcast, or the people brought onto the podcast as guests, or other elements. So take a moment and feel free to put some notes in chat. And keep in mind that there is no correct answer here. So much of this is going to be personal. What draws you to a podcast, what turns someone else off to a podcast. Clear voices and humor. Similarly, if someone prefers to unmute and speak into the Zoom, you're more than welcome to, but you will be caught on the video. The structure, the way the information unfolds, conversational style, interviewing, conciseness, straight to the point without a lot of extra unrelated chat. On the flip side, some people like long form podcasts. And so some people want the really short, and some people want just give me the info and get out. And again, it's sort of in the ear of the beholder. We'll wait just another moment to see if any other ideas come through chat. And while you're coming up with some additional ideas, if you're thinking about podcasting and you're not sure how to answer these questions, then I would invite you to listen to a range of podcasts to get a sense of what you like. Because if you don't like the podcast that you're creating, it's going to be really hard to get other people to like it. So you need to think about the kind of content you want, the kind of structure you want, the kind of vibe you want. And again, that's going to be different for other folks, for everybody. One of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about at our Podcasting Institute is authenticity, that the authenticity of the people who are podcasting, the relationship between hosts or host and guest, or the podcaster and the audience matters to folks. And so you want to think about that as well. Someone writes, I'm turned off by podcasts that are always trying to sell me something. Yeah, that's a big one. And that's becoming a bigger problem. We're seeing a little bit of, or a lot more commercialization of podcasting, people trying to get people to subscribe to unlock extra content, or the placement of ads. And that's something that happens as a podcast gets bigger. And I agree with that's something I don't like as well. We'll keep thinking about these things over the course of these 5 weeks. And again, podcasting is deeply personal, so it's really a matter of you figuring out what speaks to you and what you think will speak to the people you want to be talking with. Okay, very briefly. And someone writes, the Patreon model as opposed to sponsorship is a lovely, much more communal based way to keep a podcast going, because it does take resources. So we're going to take a little bit of time to talk through planning a podcast. And again, this is a very sort of superficial introduction to this. So this is really just to get you started thinking. For those of you who are familiar with the digital project lifecycle, you might have seen something like this diagram before. It's an iterative model. I think I was borrowing from software design in this case, where you might be iteratively going through multiple phases of a digital project lifecycle at any given time, from pre-planning all the way to release to and thinking about preservation. When we talk about the podcast creation life cycle, what we're talking about is that, there's a planning phase, there's the recording phase or the production phase, there's the post-production phase, and then there's the phase where you get it, you put it out into the world. And roughly this workshop series is going to follow that life cycle. But again, it's not always linear. It can be iterative. You can bounce back and forth between different phases of this, or you could be going at doing 2 phases at once, right? You might be releasing half a season while still producing the second half. There are lots of great how-to guides to get you started if you've never done this before, particularly if you're thinking about academic podcasting. Stacey Copeland and Hannah McGregor's Guide to Academic Podcasting, which is an open access text that came out in 2021, is an ideal starting place. Hannah McGregor works on scholarly communication, and particularly podcasting as scholarly communication, and how to evaluate and engage in peer review for podcasting. And she's created a lot of resources as well as infrastructure for academic podcasting. There's lots of other examples out there, including transom.org. And a lot of people really like Out on the Wire by Jessica Abel, which is a podcast about how to make stories. So it's a little less maybe focused on the technical mechanics of podcasting, but more on storytelling. And that's really important. Because no matter what type of podcast you're creating, there's some sort of story there that you're trying to capture and share with others. More than anything, and I encourage folks, no matter what kind of digital project they're engaging in, to think through some of these questions early in their process. Why do you want to create a podcast? What are you trying to achieve with that? Not just because it's cool, but having a reason to do it, because it takes time and it takes energy. So if you're going to devote that kind of time, it's really a good idea to know why and to articulate that to yourself. Thinking about who you're creating a podcast for, you might have an intended audience and it might be a very small audience, or you might be trying to, go viral with an intended audience, and then people who discover your podcast and come to it from outside a particular community. That ties to the why and the whom. What will this podcast be about? And then following that, what kind of podcast are you going to do? Are you going to do panel style interview, more storytelling with kind of like This American Life, with different acts that are threaded together by an overarching theme? How are you going to get it done? How are you going to account for your time and all the other things you've got going on? We are all very busy people. How are you going to think about your own labor? Knowing that, especially as you're getting started, it's going to take more time than you think, because you might have to learn new technologies and learn how to produce and how to stick to a production schedule. If you're an academic, thinking about this not as a one-off or a side hustle, but thinking about it as part of your identity, how is it going to fit into your broader scholarly persona? How do you want it to count? And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this session. And there is a question in chat about whether podcasting is audio only or whether video is involved. Once upon a time, it was audio only. We are starting to see video content as part of podcasting, and either as additional features of podcasting, or occasionally people will use YouTube for podcasting. By definition, it is still audio. You can incorporate video, and if you think you want video as part of it, that is something to factor into your planning. Or if video is more important to you, then maybe there's another medium. Maybe you want to pursue TikTok or something else. There aren't many expectations of video components to audio podcasts. And I'm not even sure, I don't think most of the typical podcast platforms like Apple and or streaming services include video. So listeners would have to go check out the video content elsewhere. I haven't checked that in a while, so don't quote me on that. Okay. It can feel really overwhelming to get started on a podcast once you've answered these questions and have a sense of what type of podcast you want to do, and maybe even a sense of what the episodes are going to be for your season. Whenever someone's delving into a digital project, I always encourage them to start by reflecting on their traditional or conventional processes for doing any kind of work, whether it's writing a syllabus, writing an assignment, writing a chapter, writing a book, whatever it is. And think through your tried and true writing processes and then adapt them to the digital. So whatever ways you've tried in the past, reflect on that and try to bring that into the world of podcasting. So that might be different for different people. You might have a general sense of topics and want to free write a little bit. Some folks want to be fully scripted before they do any kind of podcasting. You might be more of a visual thinker and want to storyboard your ideas. It really depends. And you might need to do more or less research depending on the type of podcast you want to do. So I really encourage you, again, just as there's no one right answer to like what makes for a good podcast, same with this. There's no one fully correct process for creating a podcast. It really has to depend on your own processes. And if you haven't yet reflected on your creation processes, I encourage you to start there before you start thinking about podcasting. Being self-aware of your own processes can really help you adapt to a new medium. For those of you who are interested in storyboarding, it can be a really lovely way to help you think through a podcast. And you can do this to start to get a sense of what a general template might look like for a show with multiple episodes. So Barry Lamb and others recommend a template where you have a structure, and it's a very predictable structure. You might start with a little intro vignette, then the host intro, then vignette, delve into an interview, maybe another break for another vignette, whatever it is. Storyboarding can help you figure that out first on that global scale. And then if you're going to stick to one template, then once you've storyboarded it, then you kind of have a sense of how to plan an individual episode. And the more experienced you get, the more you'll get a sense of, okay, I need to do a 30-minute interview to boil it down to a 15-minute interview segment on my podcast or whatever it's going to be. There's lots of tools out there that you can use. This is an example of someone using Prezi. I don't like Prezi. The motion in Prezi makes me feel ill, so I tend to avoid Prezi. Storyboarder is a free and easy storyboarding tool that you can certainly play with. Some people like Miro. I've sometimes used Padlet for this. If you have Google, you can do a Jamboard. You can do a regular Word doc or a Google Doc, or you can even just use pen and paper. Oftentimes when I encourage folks to sketch to get started on a project, I encourage them just to use pen and paper and then take a photo of that. And then they can include that as an artifact of their process. As with any kind of project, whether it's digital or analog, you want to rely on backward design. So figure out what it is you're trying to create, break it down into its component parts, and figure out how you're going to get there, how you're going to set small milestones to keep you on track, but reasonable milestones, reasonable time frame. If you want to launch a podcast at the end of a semester, you have to think about all of the pressures of the semester cycle, and that there might be times in the semester when you don't have time to work on your podcast because you might be grading a lot, or you might be in the throes of committee meetings or something like that. So thinking through where you're going and then how to get there, and build in a lot of wiggle room there, especially as you're getting started. When we engage in these backward design processes and these planning processes, it's really important to focus on that big picture. I always start by asking folks, what are your values? And how does what you want to create align with those values or extend those values? And from there, how does that help you define your goal and purpose? Again, your audience. Do you have some sort of overarching argument or through line, maybe for a season or for or just for an episode? Thinking about what is your podcast about? And again, how does that tie to your values, your goal, and your purpose? And then as you begin answering those questions, thinking realistically about what you have to have, what is absolutely essential, and what would be nice. So, you might want to do a season with 15 episodes. Maybe you don't need to do 15 to start. Maybe you want to start with 5, test the waters, and then go from there. So rather than when you launch your podcast, promise 15, maybe you start small and scale up when you can. I always encourage folks to start small and then scale up. So give yourself permission to take good ideas, good content, and park them in the optional parking lot. This is a great idea. I give myself permission to forget about it for now and come back to it in 6 months if I have time. I would love to do something with this, but I just don't have time for it. It's not essential to what I'm trying to do right now. If you're a seasoned podcaster or you're very comfortable in the world of audio-visual editing, you might be able to start at a larger scale. But if you're learning technology in addition to trying to create a podcast, be kind to yourself and start small. We'll talk about this similarly if for those of you thinking about incorporating podcast into your pedagogy, how to start small in the classroom as well. And then thinking about sustainability. This is a really tricky thing in digital humanities. The tech change is really fast, although podcasting tech has remained fairly stable since podcasts were first developed as a technology. But even if the technology is fairly stable, our capacity shifts. We don't always have access to the same resources. If you've ever had a grant to create a project, a digital project or otherwise, you have lots of resources until you don't. And then keeping that project going without those grant resources can be really tricky. There are some things we can predict and some things we can't. So if you're doing a grant-funded podcast, you know that someday the grant funds will dry up. And if you're going to keep the podcast going, you need to find an alternate way to sustain it. So there's a couple things you can do to plan for those known unknowns. Again, you can scope and scale down. In the Podcasting Institute, we use the work of Adrienne Marie Brown to frame our time together, her principles of emergent strategy. And she reminds us that small is good. So we don't have to create a massive podcast that gets tens of hundreds of thousands of listeners. We can create a very small thing for a small group of people, and it can be short-lived. We can keep it a little simpler. Maybe we decide, at least for start, we have bare bones production values, not a lot of fancy soundscaping because we don't have the capacity for that. Or we might have the capacity now, but we're not going to have it in 2 years. Thinking about how you can integrate it into your day-to-day and make it count towards your whatever job you're in, rather than have it be something you have to do on the side. And it's okay to decide it has an end date. It doesn't have to persist or last forever. And so thinking about that as a way to think about sustainability. You don't have to keep everything going forever. So thinking through that as well. One thing we talk a lot about in the Podcasting Institute and really any kind of project management training that I do is thinking about your processes and the sort of intrinsic dependencies built into this kind of work and how you might be able to break apart those dependencies. So a task dependency is a task that you can't start till another one is done. You cannot edit audio until you've recorded that audio. So thinking through how you can identify some of these choke points and bottlenecks in your planning phase so that you can plan for those can really help. If you're working collaboratively, you want to work in parallel as much as possible. So, if you're editing a podcast, you might be able to edit it in chunks. So we're recording Act 1 while someone else is editing Act 2 or something like that. If you're producing a whole season, you want to think about how to, you might want to be editing and doing post-production on a set of, maybe 3 or 4 episodes before you go on to record the next set, right? So maybe you don't record all 10 episodes, maybe, or you don't want to maybe record one and then edit. You might record in chunks and then edit in chunks. And that allows you to be working a little bit more independently or in parallel. If you're doing all the things, then you can't really work in parallel because you can only do one thing at a time. Which is to say, I encourage folks to find collaborators for podcasting. A couple additional considerations just to think about. There's going to be technological hurdles and constraints. You're going to need to make some choices about the tools you use. We're going to be showing you one set of tools during this workshop. you might want to use a different set of tools. There are going to be tech fails and crashes, and this happens all the time. It's just inevitable. At our last Podcasting Institute, someone didn't realize till the morning of the last day when we were getting ready for our listening party that there was a corruption in one of their files, and they lost some of their work, and there was nothing they could do about it other than try to stitch things together or re-record. And they didn't have time at that point to do it. And that was really unfortunate, but these things happen and we have to build time in for that. There's also tech fails and crashes that happen outside of our control. So you might be using Spotify for your podcast hosting service, and Spotify could experience an outage, whether due to hacking or something else. This happens from time to time, and there's nothing we can do about it other than plan for that certain uncertainty, whichever it is. If you're working in a team, there's going to be hurdles and constraints there. Collaboration is so beautiful, but coordinating schedules can sometimes feel like herding cats. You want to think through how you can create an equitable division of labor and create systems of accountability to each other, which is to say, we might, as a team, decide on a particular production schedule. We might also want to give ourselves permission to break that production schedule and be honest about what we've got going on. So rather than just disappear if you can't make a deadline, letting your team know, hey, I need more time on this, and folks can plan accordingly. And then there's going to be lots of different stuff you're going to be working with. You're going to have lots of different audio files, potentially in different file formats. We're going to cover that in a later workshop. You are going to have lots of things sources and things you're going to be crediting. You're going to need to produce transcripts and other kind of extras, which we'll talk about in the 4th workshop. So you're going to need some sort of system to track and maintain everything. Which brings me to one of my favorite things to talk about, and I could do a whole workshop just on file management. Many of you have heard this spiel before from me, so apologies, but and many of you are familiar with this already, but it just bears a little bit of attention. File management matters, not just in podcasting, but in everything. It really helps you make sure that you are working on the right version of the thing. And this is really important for when you're pushing things out into the world, right? You don't want to accidentally put a draft version of your podcast on your platform that people are going to listen to. And so we're going to talk about 2 key principles, file naming and versioning. And this is going to be especially important if you're working in a team. Okay, take a look at these file names here. I'm going to launch another poll. Which file name do you think is the best one? And think about why. We'll just give it a moment. Okay, just about everybody has voted, and there is 100% agreement that that last file name is the best. I'm going to end the poll, even though a couple people haven't voted yet, in the interest of time. Anybody care to share why you voted for that last file name? You can either do it in chat, or if you don't mind being caught in the video that goes up on YouTube, you can unmute and speak into the space.
Has the most detail. However, I was a little concerned with anything saying final. I don't like putting final on any file name because no matter what, it's never a final.
Yes, thank you. And I'm not quite sure who said that, but thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. Oh, Kevin, great. Thank you so much. Great point. But it has the most detail, right? You know who the author is. That's me. You know what the paper is. And in this case, I think final just meant final paper of the semester, not final version. Maybe, I'm not sure. We know the class and we know the time period, fall 2023. Someone else comments that it is machine readable. Yes, it is in a format. I don't use spaces. I use the underscores. Lately, I've been using hyphens instead of underscores or dashes, but it's something that a machine can process as well. So that's pretty easy. It's also not the longest file name. I have to admit, I abuse the length of file names all the time. So ideally, we want short but meaningful file names. Best practice is to identify a couple of key attributes to use to describe and then to find your files, and apply that same structure both to the folder directories and the files themselves so that you can find things again pretty easily. We want to avoid special characters. I sometimes violate this as well. Back in the old days when we had to hard code websites and manually load our files to create our websites, this really mattered that you didn't have spaces or special characters that could throw things off. If you're doing a serialized thing, you're going to want to use a numbering system that accounts for the range. So if you're going to do more than 10 things, it's always good to do a leading zero. If you think you're going to do 100 things, use a couple leading zeros, and that will just help you sort things numerically. Okay, let's make this a little more complicated now. Take a look at these conference paper names and think about which is the final version, or the, as final as anything can be in this world. I'm going to launch another poll and vote for the one you think is actually the final version. And unlike the first poll, there is no consensus on this one. People are voting for almost every option here. I'll give it just another moment. This one's a hard one. Okay. I know not everyone has voted, but in the interest of time, I'm going to end the poll. The last three were the most popular. 4 people picked the last 3. But again, no consensus. There is no way to know which one is the final. Maybe the person who created these files has a very particular way that they know their own versioning system. But let's imagine that this is from 3 years ago. Do they remember that system? So some people think the first one because it only has one final. Some people think it's the use of capital letters. Some people think it's use this one. The point is we don't know. This is really tough. And as one person said, I don't want to vote for any of them. And I agree with you there. So it's really important to engage in versioning. A lot of times people will say in the world of, when we're talking about like a Word doc or a Google doc, you can look at the date modified and it can tell you which is the most recent version. That doesn't always work. Just the other day, I accidentally opened an old file. I accidentally hit something and made a change and then closed it. I didn't save the change, but it changed the date modified. Or I might have saved it accidentally. I can't remember. So we can't always rely on the built-in metadata associated with that file to know when it was last modified. So there's lots of different ways that you can version. You can use date. I like to use the ISO year, month, day, so that I can organize my files chronologically. Some people like to put dashes between the year, month, day. I don't do that just because I have very long file names and I'm trying to smush things together a little bit more. Some people do version 1, version 2, version 3. I often do a combination of things because what counts as a version versus like draft 1 versus draft 1A. I'm not really sure. Everybody does this a little bit differently, but it's really important that you come up with a system and you stick with it. And I highly encourage folks to document your choices because you might remember your file naming and versioning system today, but 5 years from now, you might not, or your system might change. I've noticed in my own work, how I name my files has shifted over time. And it's okay, but really it's good to document that. Also, if you're working in a team and you think that people are going to be rolling onto your team midway through maybe season 2, having everything documented helps them get acclimated to your naming culture. You want to be explicit and you want to stick to it. I'm not saying you have to go back and rename all the files in your computer and on your cloud drives right now, but just moving forward, think through that. And then you always want to work on a copy. Now, luckily, when we're working in audio editing software, we're always bringing in a copy of things, or almost always bringing in a copy of files. So it becomes a little bit a good fail-safe against that. But just some things to think about. And it just, taking the time to get organized before you get started will save you time and headache down the road. I promise. And also, you want to back everything up. So we love to recommend the 3-2-1 rule. You want to have a couple copies local and one offsite, recognizing that cloud storage has, environmental impacts. But keep something on your computer, keep something on some sort of external drive or flash drive, and then other backups. There's any number of ways you can create these systems. In our first virtual institute back in 2020, a student dropped her laptop midway through the institute and had to go get it repaired, and had a bunch of the recording files on her computer, or she was editing or something, and she hadn't yet had a chance to back things up. And so the team lost a little bit of time there while they waited for her to see what she could recover. We never want that to happen. Gabe reminds me that there's also platforms out there that help with versioning. So Git also does allow for that kind of version control once you've gotten over the learning curve. Google has gotten a little bit stronger in versioning, where you can revert to older versions of things. That's a little more tricky with audio files. So again, versioning is going to really help you, so you know which is the final version or the version, let's say the version you're going to release into the world of your podcast. Okay, we have just a few minutes left. We are covering so much ground, and I appreciate you staying along for the ride. I want to talk a little bit about copyright, with the disclaimer that I am not a lawyer. I am not a copyright expert. I do not understand our copyright laws, and I cannot dispense legal advice. But we have a tip sheet that covers some copyright issues, and a slide deck from Janelle Belmas, who is a faculty member at the University of Kansas, who took our Faculty Institute Faculty Institute a couple years ago. She studies copyright law. She's not a lawyer, and she gives presentations on copyright, public domain, fair use, things like that. Copyright is complicated. I am of the belief that our copyright laws have not caught up to our technology, and our copyright laws in the United States are incredibly arcane and behind the curve compared to other laws elsewhere. But if you're trying to build a very rich soundscape, you might need a lot of different sound. If you're doing a more stripped down interview style, this might be less of an issue for you. But we get a lot of questions during the Institute about what can you use and whether fair use applies. Again, I cannot give you an answer to these questions, but these are things you're going to need to think through, potentially find someone you can consult with. News clips, depending on the news source, can be used in podcasting. I would recommend not using any kind of cable news clips. But then what about TV or movies? There are podcasts where people do sort of listening parties and then deconstruct, or sort of viewing parties and then deconstruct the show or the movie that they've watched. Can you excerpt clips from the TV show or the movie? It's tricky. Can you sample music? Also tricky. We in the Institute encourage everyone to use Creative Commons or public domain music that is put out there without that kind of licensing restriction. If you have funds, you can purchase a copyrighted sound library without violating anybody's copyright. So if you're on a grant or you're thinking about putting together a grant for a podcast, you can write that into your grant and buy a library if you want more possibilities there. Lots of great places to get free music and sound effects. I lean heavily on the Free Music Archive. It's changed over the years, and they're trying to push people to buy stuff, but there is still free music that you can get there, and it's organized by genre. are my favorite website for sound effects is Free Sound. If you need a sound effect that you can't create on your own, you can create an account for free and look for free sounds. The Internet Archive has some stuff. The Library of Congress released Citizen DJ a while back. YouTube claims to have a free music audio library. I never know with YouTube just how trustworthy that is, so I'm always a little cautious there. If you are musically inclined or have musicians in your life, you can always ask them to produce original work for you that you can promote on your show. And always give credit for the content you use and reuse. You can do that as a voiceover on your end credits, as well as in your show notes. Use it as an opportunity to promote other folks. Okay, in the last 5 minutes, and I'm frankly a little surprised we got through everything. I'm modestly impressed with myself, but I think I've had enough coffee that I'm talking a mile a minute. I want to talk a little bit about how to make this count. If you are an academic and you are thinking about how to integrate this into your scholarly profile, folks are working on this. So I mentioned earlier Hannah McGregor, who's at Simon Fraser University. She works on scholarly communication and podcasting as a form of scholarly communication. And she's been creating infrastructure for peer review for podcasting, particularly through the Amplify Podcast Network. You can request to submit your podcast for open peer review. Reviews in Digital Humanities also engages in podcast reviews, and Kairos does as well. Many professional societies are starting to do this. I'm a historian by training, and I've seen the Organization for American Historians doing both digital project and podcast reviews in the Journal of American History. Likewise, I think that the MLA is probably doing stuff like this. They've got really good guidelines for the evaluation of digital scholarship on their website. So there are mechanisms in place to make your podcast legible as a form of scholarly communication as you pursue tenure and promotion for those of you in a tenure track position. But we also want to think about how we can use podcasting to blur and break boundaries in our work. And Hannah McGregor talks a lot about this, that, yeah, we recognize the reality of we need to make our work fit the categories and the criteria of our institution. But also, like a lot of digital humanities, this work really blurs a lot of that. It's more collaborative than a lot of, for those of you who are humanists, than a lot of humanists are trained to do. It's more publicly engaged. It's often very community driven. And so while we have structures that are coming into place to help us make those podcasts legible in our promotion files, we're also thinking about how we can use podcasting to maybe transform our institutional expectations for what counts. If you are tenured, if you are mid or late career, and you are in a position where you can have that conversation at your institution, please do so. Please create a pathway for folks who are early career wanting to pursue these pathways. So do that if you can. Okay. Couple other things, and then we'll pause for questions. This is the end of the formal content for this first workshop. Next Friday, we're going to talk about ways of recording, and we're going to demo some different recording approaches. Again, if you can't attend the workshop, we'll record it and put it up on YouTube as soon as the video is available. And all of the resources are available to you asynchronously. These resources will persist for as long as my institution can support Google Drive and as long as I have a Google Drive account. So you can always refer back to them. You can always reuse them. There's a statement in the folder about Creative Commons reuse. You can catch up on anything you missed on our YouTube channel. We also have a feedback form. Love to hear your feedback. You can do it after each workshop, or you can do it at the end of the series. Again, if you registered before this morning, you would have gotten that link in your email. Really quickly, let me just throw that link in the chat really quickly. Sorry, I'm working off of two screens, which I find incredibly challenging in Zoom. And Patrick and I are here for you. So whether you can attend the rest of the workshops or not, whether you're at SDSU or not, please let us know how we can help you. So get in touch. We're always happy to hop in a Zoom or have a meeting with you to get you started. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have if you want to hang back after we're done. And thank you for joining us for this first workshop.